decision at a later stage, should we be able to provide even further evidence of the IEC's favouring of the African National Congress. We believe that the judgment shows that the DA's case had merit and we were right to bring the case to the court, and that that is reflected in the fact that no costs order was granted against the DA. Obviously, it's not the outcome that we wanted, but nonetheless, we respect the court, the Apex Court, and we respect the judgment made therein. We've had a very successful registration weekend. We're very pleased that we were able to meet a number of the targets that we set. And now the focus has to be on the elections in just over 6 weeks' time. And that's going to be the focus of the party going forward. But at the same time, we're going to put the IEC on notice that we're going to be watching them like hawks. Just simply, we remain of the view that they've made this decision to reopen the candidate nomination to favour the ANC. And this is not, had they followed the precedents that they had applied themselves in elections past to both the IFP and the NFP, they would not have reopened the electoral timetable. And we remain of the view that it had been the DA or any other opposition party that found itself on the wrong side of that timetable, that there wouldn't have been the same eagerness to overturn it. This is borne out by the fact that in the IEC's own founding affidavits before the court, they argued that it was not possible to reopen the candidate nomination process. They specifically tackled the EFF's prayer in their papers to reopen the candidate nomination process. And yet, a few weeks later, they've done a complete volte-face and have now adopted a completely different approach. We find that highly suspicious, and we certainly are going to be monitoring the IEC incredibly carefully to make sure that they hold these elections in a free and fair manner, in which way that doesn't favour any particular party, and that all parties are treated absolutely the same. Fortunately, we've seen a fraying of a number of our institutions in South Africa through cadre deployment and other mechanisms and measures. What we want to ensure is that we have an IEC that really is independent and that is able to announce with credibility election results in South Africa. The DA is, for the first election in its history, fielding a candidate in every single ward across the country. We were able to get our candidates in before the deadline using exactly the same computer system that the ANC did. Our deposits are paid, our lists are in, our posters are going up, and our candidates are campaigning around the country. We had a very successful registration weekend, and we look forward to continuing to take our message that the DA gets things done. And if you want evidence of that, you need to see that we got things done by getting all of our candidates and all of our papers work in on time, unlike the ANC, and that we're a party that's on the march and ready to take our pitch and message to every corner of South Africa. And that's certainly the focus over the next 6 weeks. Thank you, Saviwe.
Thanks, John. And so I'm going to hand over to you, Helen. Would you please just provide some technical aspects of the judgments that we are looking at before I hand over to Werner, who's going to be talking to us about the IEC and the past weekend.
Thanks, Siviwe. Well, John has really made all the key political points, and although I'm not a lawyer, the following is quite clear to me. The minister rushed into proclaiming the election on the 3rd of August. That meant that the deadline for submitting all of the candidates was the 23rd of August. We all knew that. In fact, we had known that this would be a deadline around there since May. The minute that the 23rd of August kicked in as the deadline, obviously the DA had to work extra hard, but we had to get the things in then. And the ANC, as is now common cause, missed that deadline. Now, in subsequent court cases, the Constitutional Court did rule that the proclamation of the minister on the 3rd of August was null and void. And that was the gap that the IEC used to say, okay, there will have to be a reproclamation of the election, so then we'll be able to reset the deadlines and reset the timetable, which is the gap they have taken. And the Constitutional Court has ruled that under Section 11.2 of the Municipal Electoral Act, they do have the power to set deadlines and a timetable after the proclamation of the election. And given the fact that it is a re-proclamation of the election, they have that power again, irrespective of what motives they may have had in doing so. So while they technically have the power, the court has left the question of their motives in moving in that way open, and we are pleased they've done that, because it basically says the court is saying, watch this space very, very carefully. And the court has not for a moment dismissed the analysis that the DA has had accompanying this very strange set of circumstances in which the IEC sets a deadline. It says to the Constitutional Court it can't possibly change voter registration or candidate registration unless the election is postponed till 2022. When the court says you can't postpone the election till after the constitutionally determined date on the 1st of November, suddenly the IEC says, oh, well, in that case, we can hold a voter registration. And because we are holding a voter registration, in case any of those newly registered voters want to stand as candidates, we better open the candidate registration as well. We find that sequence of events interesting. The court clearly also found it very interesting, and we will be watching that space very closely indeed.
Thank you, Helen. And so I think what is important from both what Helen and John has stated is that, number one, we accept the Concourt ruling and that we are now ready to roll out our election campaign, but we will obviously be keeping a very strong eye on the IEC and the processes that will unfold from now going forward. And we are the only political party that has shown that we're ready for this election campaign. We are launching our manifesto this coming weekend. Our posters are up and we've got candidates in every single ward. But Vanna, before we open to questions, can I ask that you provide just some reflections on, firstly, any parts of the judgment that we may have missed, and secondly, a reflection on the performance of the IEC this past weekend?
Yeah, thank you, Suviwe. I think what is important to take from the judgment also in order to reflect on this past weekend's registration weekend was that the court ultimately, in a very subtle way, has pointed the Electoral Commission to its legislative and constitutional duties. So whilst the court said in as many words that it on the papers will defer to the Commission in as far as the Commission has the right to amend the timetable, the court, as John already said, in very clear terms said that we will not make a final determination on whether the Commission acted with an ulterior motive. The court also, in reference to the 180-degree U-turn Helen has referred to, which the Commission made in dealing with both voter registration and the reopening of the candidate nomination system, in diplomatic terms said that, well, we are of the view that quite possibly our previous order pointed the Commission into a state of being more solutions-oriented. So that's interesting. And of course, it is so that we've had the registration weekend over the past weekend. From our side, we have noted that this was not a seamless exercise. Even if one takes into consideration that the Electoral Commission implemented or rolled out its new voter management devices, and that glitches was to be expected, it must be said that for the large part, the voter management devices over the weekend did not operate in the way the Commission envisaged it to operate. We must remind ourselves that this was supposed to be new generation devices that would assist the Commission to register voters in real time. The big difference, of course, being that the old zip machines issued voters with a sticker which indicated or was at least proved to voters that they've applied for registration as voters. The new system was supposed to produce a real-time SMS informing voters, firstly, that the IEC received their application for registration or re-registration, and secondly, in real time, informing voters that registration has been completed. Now, given the fact that the mapping function built into these voter management devices gave massive problems from Wednesday last week in respect of the online registration platform, ultimately the Commission for big parts of the weekend reverted to using these voter management devices in offline mode, which of course did not allow voters the opportunity to have proof of their application for registration as voters, and that's wholly unsatisfactory. As we speak, we as a party are being inundated today with voters saying, I've still not received my SMS. When we assist them, in many cases, it's quite clear that their registration status has, as a matter of fact, been updated, but the SMS system, which the IEC said would enable them to communicate with voters regarding registration in a credible way, seemingly is failing us and the IEC. And in other instances, it's quite clear that applications for online registration and in certain parts of the country, still applications made on the voter management devices has still not been finalized. Of course, it is so that the IEC has until midnight tonight to receive applications for voter registration. And therefore, our plea is for people who still not do have proof that they've re-registered to either SMS their IDs to 32810 to check whether it's been updated, or to visit the IEC's website. And if at all possible, to still make use of the IEC's online registration platform register2vote.elections.org.za in order to ensure that they're able ultimately to vote. The fact that these devices function primarily in the offline mode also had the knock-on effect of not all registration officials being able to use the offline functionality. So in that sense, it's quite clear that the rollout of training in respect of these new devices was not sufficient. And in many cases, the presiding officers on their own accord then resorted to jotting down the personal details of prospective voters in order to finalize registration afterwards. Our frustration was, of course, that we asked the IEC in the run-up to the registration weekend, specifically once the address or mapping function clearly showed up in the days before the registration weekend, to enable all registration officials in a uniform way to deal with some sort of a paper-based application process. That was refused, and ultimately the Commission will also now have to answer the question why it allowed a situation where prospective voters at certain voting stations over the weekend were not being assisted with registration through a parallel or paper-based process, whilst in others it was allowed. We are, as it is, still collating the information as to what the specific voting stations were, where voters ultimately were not assisted in this way. And if our analysis once again shows that this was primarily in stronghold areas of the Democratic Alliance, we will have further engagement with the Electoral Commission in this regard. Maybe to wrap up then regarding voter registration, it is of course also so that, and that's not necessarily the Commission's fault, unfortunately the amount of new voters that were added to the voters roll over the registration weekend did not make up for the attrition on the voters roll caused by deaths and quite possibly immigration over the last years. That was not wiped out. So we will sit with a smaller voters roll than in past elections, which is not good for the health of our constitutional democracy. And quite possibly the Electoral Commission will have to reflect also on the way it approached this year's election and whether that has impacted on the lower number of prospective voters that had turned up at registration points over the weekend. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Werner. I'm going to take questions in groups of 3. There's some that have been written on the chat. If you would also like to ask questions, you're more than welcome to. Please raise your hand. So from what I can tell, I think I'll take about 2 rounds of 3, and then we can close off. The first one